appreciate it. As I noted at the top, this is the 4th of 6 webinars that we are doing on the rules. We have already talked about the impact of the rules on sponsors and intermediaries. We've talked about the impact of the rules on employers. We have a webinar to come that's going to look at some of the assessment rules that are now built into, or that would be built into the proposed rules. We have a webinar coming up on systems and some of the changes to the apprenticeship system that are proposed in these rules. But today we're going to focus on registration and these occupational standards rules that are part of the proposed rules. And let me just say, by way of background here, yeah, I'll get to housekeeping in a second. Let me just say, by way of background, these proposed rules were published in the Federal Register just last week, Wednesday last week, I think, yes, Wednesday last week. From that date, a 60-day comment period kicks off. And so at Apprenticeships for America, we're very interested in organizing ourselves to provide the Department of Labor with comments on these rules. We think that within these rules is a call from the department for feedback, for advice, for guidance on these, and we're taking them at their word because it's certainly our hope that as we work through the comment period and get our comments to the department, that there'll be an opportunity to shape these rules as they move on to the next phase. And just so you know, the next phase, after the rules have been commented on, there is an Office of Management and Budget review process, and then the rules are republished or revised based on those comments. The Office of Management and Budget will then look at the final version of the rules, and then they go into effect. Our sense is that nothing is immediately going to happen with these rules, that this is going to be a fairly lengthy process, sort of working through all these changes. So if you're worried that you suddenly have to change your programs based on some of the rules you're going to hear about today, be rest assured you're going to have some time on that. And even within the rules, there are transition processes that sort of help us move from the current rules to the proposed rules. With that as background, I'm just going to walk us through a couple of housekeeping items here. So first off, because we have a fairly large group today, ask you about 51 people, we ask you to keep your mute on. Feel free to use your cameras. It's good to see you all. Use the raise hand tool if you want to speak. That'll just help us recognize you and manage the discussion, questions and answers. We also ask you to make active use of the chat for questions or comments. We're saving the chat. And a recording and summary of this session will be available. We're running a little bit behind getting those done, but we're hoping to have the first couple of sessions ready for release in summary by the end of this week, and next week to have the remaining done. As I say, welcome to the members. If you haven't already, encourage you to join. Just going to put that in the chat. Encourage you to join Apprenticeships for America. It's a really easy process, and it helps us stay in touch with you and engage with you through this and through other processes. So I'm gonna, with no further ado, I'm just gonna move us along here. And the first thing we're gonna do is do an overview. I forgot we're gonna do an overview. So today's session is gonna really come in sort of 3 parts. So the first is we're gonna talk about the rules' impact on the registration process. And we'll take a little question and answer around that. Then we'll take a little bit of a dive into some of the occupational standards, do a question and answer on that. We have a very brief analysis of how the rules square up against some of the AFA proposals that we've been making around registration. So we'll just sort of quickly run through that, and then we'll have an open conversation. And if we do all this right, we should have about 25 or 30 minutes for conversation. Okay, but to get started, who are you, as the who would say? So if you could please go to menti.com, enter that code at the top, or use your phone and use the locator here to navigate to the survey form. This will just give us a sense of who's in the room and who's participating in this process. Always glad to see the apprenticeship intermediaries engaged in this process. Thanks, everyone. We'll give it just 1 or 2 more minutes or seconds. Excellent. Okay, so as we would expect, this is a session that really is going to impact apprenticeship intermediary sponsors. So we're glad to have you with us. Those from the various offices of apprenticeship and the SAAs, welcome. Great to have you with us as our training partners and our partners in the workforce development system. As I put in the chat, there's a whole variety of materials that we want you to be aware of. First off, the rules themselves have now been published in the Federal Register. They're also on the Department of Labor's website with a commentary, so please do take advantage of those resources. AFA has done up a summary of the rules. It's still pretty lengthy. The rules themselves are fairly lengthy, but at least it's a sort of quick guidebook, a quick reference book to the rules. We've also done a side-by-side review, looks at the current rule, the rules as they are proposed for standard apprenticeship, and the rules as they're proposed for CTE apprenticeship. So sort of a side-by-side analysis. And we have a draft of what we're calling our burden analysis, which is looking at the impact of the rules on different stakeholders in the apprenticeship system, a sort of big lift, medium lift, low lift in terms of impact on these stakeholders. This will actually be formally published. We're hoping by the end of the week. So we're still taking feedback on that. Would love to hear any feedback you have on some of the early analysis we have in that space. And then I just want to point out that tomorrow the Department of Labor is holding the official Notice of Proposed Rules webinar and encourage everyone to sign up for that. Actually, let me just copy that. Oh, I can't copy it. It's actually up above. If you can just, you'll see that there's a link to the sign up for that webinar. I encourage you to do that. Okay, so without further ado, let's just talk about the written standards. So the registration, as we know, is significantly about setting down on paper or in electronic file the information that you're going to use to design, develop, and operate the proposed apprenticeship. And I think one thing that we see in the current rules is a lot more elaboration on what is expected to be in those written standards for apprenticeship. This page here, in all its multicolored glory, is really intended to sort of summarize the requirements under these rules. And we tried to organize especially some of the new elements under some thematic buckets that we've seen throughout the rules. So throughout the Notice of Proposed Rules, you'll see a lot of attention to apprentice protection. In many ways, I think taking a page from the Department of Education and its interest in protecting students. Similarly, the apprenticeship rules, as they're proposed, have a whole variety of provisions that are really intended to offer protection to the apprentice. And so you can see, for example, some disclosures that are required as part of the written standards, carrying forward of the theme around safety, which has always been a hallmark of the rules around apprenticeship, some new rules around wages, rules about the disclosure of any uncovered or unreimbursed costs, whether or not the related instruction components, time spent in related instruction will be paid, just a variety of sort of disclosures that are intended to sort of protect the apprentice. The second sort of bucket of new rules is really focusing on quality. And the notion here is, can we be sure that we are, as we are registering apprenticeship programs, that they are of significant quality? And so lots of new attention paid to the training and related instruction partners, and to make sure that they, in fact, have the qualifications to be able to do that work, a desire to sort of connect apprenticeship with interim credentials or industry recognized credentials or other kinds of educational credit. There's a heightened interest in how we are assessing apprenticeships. More on that actually tomorrow in our webinar. And then the third sort of bucket of thematic bucket that seems to have sort of influenced a lot of the proposed rules is really around the desire that apprenticeship programs should be open to anyone. They should be we should be reaching out to a diverse segment of society. That it should be open to participation of people of all different backgrounds. And so there's heightened interest in the procedure for selection and how apprentices are recruited, and additional information about the sort of attesting to the program's commitment to ensuring that there's a diverse and accessible apprenticeship program. So all in all, there's a lot more elaborated around the written standards. Now, the truth is, I think most of us that have done apprenticeship registration would see a lot of this as being somewhat familiar, but there's definitely these sort of new touch points within the written standards of apprenticeship. Just a little bit around the registration process itself. As a general provision, there's a variety of documentation that's expected in addition to the written standards. Our old friend, the work process schedule, is a central piece of the registration process. There's the apprenticeship agreement is also a piece of the registration process with several new components required in that apprenticeship agreement. You can see, the interest in diversity and inclusion comes up again in wanting to see that there's equitable recruitment plans for the apprenticeship. One thing that is new, and again, I think takes a page from some of the experience in the Department of Education, is a desire to see that sponsors of apprenticeship have the financial capacity to sort of see the apprenticeship through. And then there's some interest in a very broad, I would say, interest in disclosures of any adverse legal findings, both for the sponsor as well as any participating employer. And it's a very broad disclosure that's expected. And then specifically, speaking to the diversity and inclusion objectives within these rules, a whole variety of expectations in the program registration process that really speak to how the proposed apprenticeship is going to ensure that it has wide participation from all aspects of society. The registration process itself, there is an expectation that decisions would be rendered within 90 days. Importantly, those are calendar days. In the old rules, I'm told, and if Kyle's on here, that it used to be business days. It's now calendar days. There's a thank you, Kyle, with a thumbs up. Appreciate it. The one change in the registration process is a pretty hard and fast new rule that says that advisory committees in SAA states may not be the decision makers on registration. In other words, states may not downstream or may not delegate their registration decision making to the advisory body. That is really intended to reside with the office itself. And this is actually responsive to lots of feedback from the field and some frustration around some of the behaviors of the advisory committees, and so they are trying to be responsive to that. And then you can see a fairly standard set of criteria that are used to decide whether or not a program can be registered. Number one, of course, is it in a suitable or an apprenticeable, a new word is suitable, occupation. Does the apprenticeship plan actually provide apprentices with access to portable skills and competencies that can be used broadly within their occupation and within their field. There's a whole document completion review process, this financial capacity question. And then to the extent that there's any disclosures, adverse disclosures around violations or misconduct, that those have been satisfactorily addressed. So that, in a nutshell, is the registration process and the new rules around registration. Let's just take a minute here and give a chance for folks to ask any questions about the registration process. Any questions? Or Bob, yeah, please, Bob, jump in.
I think just a couple of quick points. One is that the state council issue is very dependent on enforcement by Office of Apprenticeship, because past rules have gone in this direction. The second thing is that ideally the National Occupational Frameworks, which I guess you'll cover elsewhere.
Yeah, coming up next.
Would lead to faster consideration and quicker completion of apprenticeships. In other countries, it can be one day. So,
right. So we're going to come back to that, Bob. Absolutely, and I hope you'll jump in on that conversation as our resident expert on that whole facet. That's great. Other comments or questions? Just give it a second here. Actually, I don't have my chat up. Ben, are you on the chat? Is there any anything in
No,
the
a
chat?
couple questions about making sure we can send the PowerPoint to attendees afterwards, but
absolutely, absolutely, we'll be doing that. There's a lot of text on these slides. Apologies. So yes, for sure. Great. Excellent. Okay, so yes, Jake, please jump in.
Quick clarifying question. With the kind of the first slide you shared with quality, the different components, like in order to get a program up and running, do all of those things have to be met prior to the start date of an apprenticeship?
So yes, and I think if you're sensing a sort of upstreaming of preparedness into the proposal, I think you're reading that right, or at least that's the way I read the rules. So we're reading them the same. And I know apprenticeships that I've been involved in the past. There's a lot of work on the work process schedule. But I haven't sort of lined up all the curriculum and everything that's going to sort of be in the related instruction with a provider. We sort of have it notionally outlined, but not with the level of specificity that I think the proposed rules are suggesting. So I think that is an added. I think it would be fair to say that there's potentially a burden there for sponsors.
Yeah, John, maybe we could ask, maybe we could ask people the extent to which this particular element of the changes in terms of requiring specification of the RTI provider, for example, changes what they do.
Yeah. Actually, I'd be curious. I mean, that was sort of my experience with the rules. Did other folks have that sort of all lined up and buttoned down?
That's our experience as well. But
yeah. Or would this be a sort of new requirement or a change in the way you would do registrations? Anybody want to jump in on that? Shyness.
Don't all jump in at once.
I would never think of the apprenticeship crew as a shy bunch, but
I think historically, John, my experience is that knowing who is going to deliver is decided pretty early. It's wrapping up the final details of the final curriculum pieces that does extend beyond that initial application.
Yeah, Steve, I like the way you put that, and because it essentially is requiring the education partner to do a lot on spec, right? Even before the apprenticeship has been sort of signed, and so it adds to the risk of those who are involved that they're putting in a lot of work on a project that may not go forward or is going to see significant change or what have you. That's a great way to put it, Steve. Appreciate it. All right, I'm gonna move us along, and Bob, I want to come back to that when we get into the sort of more open discussion. So back to sharing. Sorry, give me a second here. Okay. Again, Ben, can you give me a thumbs up? Thumbs up. That's working. Yeah, thank you. Great, excellent. All right. So one of the things, as Bob said, one of the sort of hopeful aspects of the rules is that perhaps we can use some of these new occupational standards or program standards guidelines to streamline the registration process. And they come in three flavors. Two of them sort of more distinctly flavors, and one's maybe a slightly different, I don't know, dessert altogether. So let me just say that the three that are out there is something called a National Occupational Standards, National Program Standards, and National Guidelines. So I think we're all reasonably familiar with National Program Standards, the idea being that there are apprenticeships that are multi-state or national in character. The idea is that you can register them sort of once, and then you've got coverage for your work across the country. And so we've seen that before. This is sometimes we have reciprocity and recognition issues at the state level, but that this is a feature we've had in our a tool we've had before. Now there are sort of two additional pieces to the equation. So the first is the National Occupational Standards, and these are really intended to be, just as Bob said, a kind of a rapid rapid approval process that if you can use the National Occupation Standards as they're described in the rules for a particular occupation, you should be able to get expedited consideration, and certainly in any case be able to take advantage of work process schedules, curricula, apprentice evaluation tools, and so on that have been developed nationally for the occupation. One thing to note about the National Occupation Standards is that if you're doing a national program registration, the National Program Standards, you're expected to use a National Occupational Standard, presumably assuming one exists. So that becomes a sort of new requirement of the National Program Standards. What else? Oh, so also on National Occupation Standards, the idea is that that these would there's this promise of a quicker registration process, but not in the rule. So the rules are actually silent on it. And I think one thing we might want to think about for comments is can we get some sort of a sign off on an expedited review process, and what would that look like, and how might we provide some advice or guidance to the department on what expedited reviews might look like under the National Occupation Standards. And you'll see in a second the way we would have done National Occupation Standards, from the AFA position paper on registration, and the way the rules are going about it are slightly different, or maybe significantly different. And so we have some further advice or guidance, I think, that we probably want to provide the department on the National Occupation Standards. Going to the other side of the table, the national guidelines, these are really intended to be sort of helping tools for the registration of apprenticeship programs at the local and at the state level. And so they use the word template for the work process schedule, curricula, and so on, with the idea that that would be modified or adjusted or changed. But in theory, as a sponsor, you could rely on the national guidelines in the preparation of your registration proposal, and maybe save yourself a bit of time and energy. The state apprenticeship agencies are not obligated to use the guidelines, but they're encouraged to do so. I should just say, under the national program standards, I think I forgot to mention, there is a call for reciprocity from SAAs around nationally registered programs. That is, as Bob will tell you, that is something that's a fight we've had before, and we'll probably continue to have in different ways. And then the last thing I'll just say is that the national guidelines are intended to be able to speak nationally, but also to recognize that there may be state and local differences. So there is not an expectation that every single piece of the guidelines would work in every jurisdiction or under every licensing regime or what have you. Bob, let me just ask you to jump in here.
Yeah, on national occupational standards, as someone who at Urban Institute who has built these standards for approval by the Office of Apprenticeship, we will have built up about 120 of them. But to create an adequate number, and also to be aware of revisions when necessary, I think you'll need a far bigger effort with funding to make this happen. So this should be considered in part aspirational, because of course there are many that are good ones we've developed and approved, but to cover the spectrum of occupational areas that we want apprentices in will take some time and funding.
Thanks, Bob. Other comments or questions, I should ask. Any other comments or questions? All right, we have one more slide and then we're gonna just open it up for conversation. So in the last several months, Apprenticeships for America has convened a group of practitioners, experts and advisors to look at the registration process and to propose reforms to the registration process. As one of the keenest pain points, I think it's fair to say, in apprenticeship policy in the United States. One of the key impediments to scaling registration has been this, scaling apprenticeship has been this registration process. And so we had a whole variety of tools that were out there, of recommendations that were out there, and we wanted to just sort of line up our recommendation against the rules to sort of see where we ended up. So for example, we really feel that there's value in having some of these national occupational standards that can be used to sort of expedite the registration process. And I think we have to say, my take would be, incremental progress in this direction. It's great to see the national occupation standards there. What we don't see is the sort of safe harbor or expedited registration processes or what have you that would be sort of the flip side of the benefits you would get from this. So it feels a little bit like maybe we're getting some overhead and not a lot of benefit. So I think there's maybe sort of some more work to be done there. Let me just say, in terms of national enforcement of national frameworks, I think we're heartened to see the call for reciprocity around national registrations. And we know that there's historically been some problems with the advisory councils in the SAA states, and so heartened to see some of the language there. we think that probably both of those could be strengthened to make sure that we're getting to the ends that we're looking at here. One of the things in the registration process that we've been interested in is this question of apprenticeability, or in the new rules called suitability of particular occupations, and sort of the somewhat onerous function, a process of working through determination of suitability for a particular occupation. And here, I think we're feeling that that actually the burden has gone up on potential sponsors around the suitability determination, and this focus on splintering, or concern about splintering, something we haven't talked about, but basically a concern that the department has voiced around taking an occupation and sort of breaking it up into smaller pieces, that may actually get in the way of the evolution of occupations as the the various as the economics and business environment changes. And so we would have some concerns or questions about how that would get implemented. The one thing that we called for in our recommendations was balancing a little bit this sort of front-end assessment of apprenticeship proposals with a back-end assessment of outcomes. And the notion being that if we had better back-end reviews and quality assurance, that we could be a little bit more forgiving on the front end. We wouldn't have to have everything sort of nailed down. We could actually look at what the results were, rather than what we think the results will be based on a proposal. And here we've a little bit ended up in the worst of all worlds, which is increased expectations for registration, for registration, and increased quality assurance and reporting requirements. And ideally, there really should be some interplay between the two, and you should be able to give up on some of on the front end if you're getting some of the back end. We just aren't seeing that. And then finally, we think the rules really add to the complexity of the registration process rather than simplifying it, and that becomes a barrier to new folks engaging in apprenticeship and bringing new partners and new occupations online. And so, we think there's probably some room in the rules for improvement there. Bob, let me if I can just ask you to jump in and see if there's anything you would add to this analysis.
Oh, well, I would just highlight the notion of speedy consideration. And one additional point is that all of these provisions are added in the context of an already strapped Office of Apprenticeship in terms of staffing. And the issue of staffing would become even more important if you're going to add all these extra provisions, because it's, somebody's going to have to look at these provisions. I don't favor all these provisions, but if you're gonna move the process, you do need to have more people. But ideally, we could maybe automate some of these approval processes. I don't know, maybe AI can help. I don't know, but something that does bode well for speed would be very much more important, and it doesn't seem to be in these rules.
Great.
I mean, the 90-day
I mean, not great.
The 90-day thing is mentioned.
Great comment.
The 90-day thing is mentioned, but I mean, ideally, if you have all your ducks together, and in the past, there have been federal reps out in various states that can get these things approved very quickly.
Right.
So there doesn't seem to be an analysis of what it takes to make the registration process a rapid one, so that once you persuade an employer to get something started, they get started.
Excellent. Thanks, Bob. Jake, I just wanted to point out the question of state SAA determinations of suitability does not appear to be contemplated in the proposed rules, at least not the way I read them. So it says only the administrator can determine whether an occupation is suitable. So I think the state suitability processes under this regime, if it were enacted, would at least have to be coordinated in some ways with the Office of Apprenticeship. And then on the national goals standard, national guideline standards, yes, on the periodic update, there is an expectation of a 5-year review, I think. I'd have to double check that, but I think a 5-year review for all, both the national occupational standards and the national guideline standards. So there would be sort of periodic reviews. But again, I think see Bob's comments about who's going to do all this. So I think that there is some question about exactly how that happens and how that gets done. On the financial suitability requirement, thanks for raising that. That has come up pretty consistently in every webinar that it's been mentioned. And I suspect, I mean, I think we can all imagine the thinking behind it, which is to sort of take a page from what we've seen on the traditional higher education side, where higher education providers go out of business, and then the students are left high and dry. I'm not sure this has been fully considered in terms of its applicability in an apprenticeship context. Bob's actually just working up an op-ed, and the notion that an employer is going to open up its books to the Department of Labor to be able to say, yeah, we're financially sustainable, just doesn't really ring right if an employer is a sponsor. So I think there's some need for clarification around exactly what this means, or maybe even a strong pushback on it.
I think there's a fundamental difference too between a college who may go out of business and they're offering a service that they're being paid for versus an employer who's making a business decision to bring the training in-house.
Yep.
It's apples and oranges.
I love that argument, Steve. And of course, in one case you've got people paying tuition, in another place you have people being paid
Exactly.
to be trained. So it does feel like just completely paralleling the regulatory regime doesn't quite work. So more to come for sure on that. Yes, thanks, Andre. Other comments or discussion on these rules as they relate to registration and the national occupations national guidelines? Any other comments? Jake, yeah.
So reading the different national occupation standards, national occupation frameworks, national guideline standards, those all kind of exist in some form now. I'm familiar with them. When I bring that up to my stakeholders or others, like, I can see their eyes glaze over a bit in the distinctions between them. And I'm just wondering, it does seem to make sense on paper, but in terms of its reception, I feel like there's some sense that it's a complicated system and that it makes it seem
even more complicated.
Kind of, yeah, like just a little bit more hard to grapple with. And like, I really think that I'm just curious, like, if others are experiencing that, or if there's any recommendations around like how to make that more attractive seeming to people.
Yeah. So would there be value in dispensing with the guidelines altogether and simply saying national occupation standards can be modified at the state level as appropriate, and they wouldn't be national occupation. I mean, but that there would be some level of opportunity to adjust them or adapt them at in particular circumstances. And I mean, Bob, you should weigh on this because you've got a whole lot more experience with this issue. But it just
yeah. So I think one of the problems with the layout is that there's sort of an implicit vision, but it's not made explicit.
Yeah.
And when you look at what other countries do, they do have entities that develop and revise national occupational standards that are then, again, put in use immediately when you go to develop a program. Everybody knows what that occupational framework is, what you're supposed to learn, and therefore can be something that can be approved very, very quickly. But the layout, ideally it could have said, well, we have a vision toward this, because in a way they seem to say it, because the national the program standards have to follow the national occupational standards when those exist. So they seem to be saying we want to move toward that vision, but we have to do it incrementally. And I think had they laid out that approach, it would be A, clearer, and B, potentially attractive by smoothing out this process.
Yep. I think one of the bits of feedback we should probably be thinking about developing as a community of practitioners is really, what in here is a good idea that maybe should be developed further before it becomes a regulatory regime, and what in here really properly should be a regulatory regime. So I think one of the concerns you have when you immediately jump past any kind of pilot testing straight to the regulatory regime is you've suddenly imposed a set of rules that doesn't allow for the kinds of dynamic experimentation and development and growth of an idea over time. And I suspect there will be a couple of places in the rules where we may want to say there's a good idea, or there's a germ of a good idea here, but it's not ready for a regulatory regime. Whether or not this is one of those, we'll see. But I think so. Let me just ask if there's any other comments, questions on this particular topic. Otherwise, I'll just conclude with a couple of remarks on where we are going with the rules review and sort of next steps in this process. Any other comments? Okay, well, first off, thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. As I said, we have 2 more to go. One tomorrow that will focus on the question of program assessment and reporting, significant new rules and expectations around reporting, as we referenced in today's webinar, and then a webinar next week that will focus on the sort of system impacts of these rules and how and the changes that are being recommended for the SAA states and for the system as a whole. I want to thank you, as I say, thank you for participating.
I just want to add one thing.
Oh yeah, Bob,
thing,
go ahead.
John,
yeah,
which is that some of you may not be ready to make your comments in this public setting, but please feel free to send emails with any thoughts that you might have, how it might affect you, what suggestions you might have to us about how we think about it. We're very open to that. That's one of the main purposes from our point of view of holding these seminars is to get the feedback from you. So thanks very much. And
Yeah, thank you.
I
So,
think one other thing,
go ahead,
John,
Bob.
if you could, are you planning to send the PowerPoints for all of the webinars to our members?
Yeah, so summaries, the videos and the PowerPoints will all be available. It takes a little bit of time to sort of work that through, but we should have those all available by the end of next week is our plan. We are going to be then working up some draft comments and reactions that we're going to be looking for feedback from you, just as Bob said. And we'll then be running a comments campaign, which will engage every single one of you and will help direct to the Department of Labor our comments and feedback on these rules. We'll be helping equip you so that you can do that, without too much heavy lifting, and make sure that your comments are heard and organized, and that we're collecting from you the stories and background that will sort of provide some color commentary to the comments that we're giving to the department. Again, thank you so much for participating. We're looking forward to continuing to engage with you on these topics. In the meantime, do be sure to sign up for Apprenticeships for America as a member. We'd love to have you as a member so you can stay engaged in these conversations. And then do consider attending our conference coming up in March on the 12th and 13th in Washington, D.C. at the registration link in the chat. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Before you go, is it answer one quick question?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
My name is Bill Krause. I